SFX, hot wind moving through soybean leaves in a cotton field outside Clarksdale, Mississippi. There is a weed that can grow taller than a pickup hood before harvest. Jam a combine header and survive the chemical that once looked like agriculture's off switch. Farmers call it pigweed. Scientists call it Palmer amaranth. But the most honest name is Pause the Bill. Because for 20 years, the Delta sprayed the same lesson into the same soil, and the weed learned it. Breath. The lesson came from glyphosate, better known under the name that reshaped American farming, Roundup. When Roundup Ready soybeans arrived in 1996, and Roundup Ready cotton followed in 1997, the sales pitch sounded less like a product and more like an escape plan. Plant the seed, spray the field. The crop lives, everything else dies. No chopping rows in 100-degree heat. 100-degree heat. No cultivating 4 days at a time. No hand crews. No fighting weeds with a tractor older than your hired help. Just spray. Wait 2 days, and the field turns clean. In the Mississippi Delta, that promise was not small. This was cotton and soybean country, flat black ground built by the river, with fields so wide the end rows looked like a line on the horizon. The soil was rich, the weeds were mean. Palmer amaranth, barnyard grass, morning glory, Johnson grass. They did not grow like background plants, they grew like competitors. Before Roundup Ready, a farmer might spend $45 to $60 an acre keeping weeds down through chemicals, cultivation, and labor. After Roundup Ready, many were doing it for less than 20. On 1,000 acres, that difference could pay a note, fix a tractor, or keep a farm alive another year. So almost everybody switched. Pause almost. The holdout was a man named Caleb Mercer. Caleb farmed 680 acres between Clarksdale and Friars Point, on land his grandfather had bought one tract at a time after years of tenant farming. It was not a show farm. It was not a research plot. It was cotton, soybeans, a little corn, an equipment shed with a tin roof, and an International Harvester 1066 that sounded like it was clearing its throat every time it started. SFX, old diesel tractor turning over, then settling into a rough idle. When the rest of Coahoma County moved to Roundup Ready seed, Caleb kept his old 6-row cultivator. 3 times each season, he took that tractor into the rows. The sweeps ran about 2 inches below the soil, just deep enough to slice weed roots without tearing into the crop. First, when the crop was small, again when the rows began to fill, a final time before canopy. Each pass took days. Dust stuck to his neck. Diesel burned by the hour. The work required a hand steady enough to run steel close to a cotton row without shaving the roots off the cotton itself. His neighbors sprayed the same acreage in a fraction of the time, and they made sure Caleb knew it. At the co-op, they called his cultivator a museum piece. At the gin, they said he was farming like the calendar had broken in 1968. At the equipment dealership, Ray Dobbins, the salesman who sold seed packages, sprayers, and chemical programs, would do the math out loud. Caleb Ray said one spring, "Your cultivator is costing you money twice. Fuel and time on the front end, stand damage on the back end. We can put you in a Roundup Ready program for under $20 an acre in weed control. You're spending close to $50, not counting what you lose when you prune roots." Caleb let him finish. Ray tapped the calculator on the counter. SFX, small plastic calculator button clicks, on 680 acres. That is more than $20,000 a year you're giving away to prove a point. Caleb said, "I'm not proving a point." Then what are you doing? Pause. I'm refusing to train my weeds. The men at the counter laughed because it sounded like one of Caleb's old man sentences. But Caleb was not speaking in riddles. He was repeating his father. His father, Harlan Mercer, had been one of the first men in that part of the Delta to trust chemical weed control, not glyphosate. That came later. In the early 1960s, Harlan used Treflan in cotton, and for a while it looked like the future had finally arrived. The fields came up cleaner than he had ever seen them. Pigweed disappeared. The cultivator stayed parked longer than it ever had. Harlan told his son that a chemical which could save a man's back was worth respecting. Then the pigweed came back. At first, it was only a few plants standing where the spray should have worked, then a patch, then a section of a field, then enough of the field to make Harlan angry at the chemical, then angry at the timing, then finally honest enough to be angry at himself. The herbicide had not changed. Pause the pigweed had. The few plants that survived were the ones carrying whatever tiny advantage allowed them to live. Those plants made seed. Palmer Amaranth can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds from one female plant. The next year, there were more survivors. Then more. It worked for a while. Then it weakened. He switched again. The same thing happened. By the time Caleb took over, Harlan no longer talked about herbicides like weapons. He talked about them like teachers. Every spray is a lesson, he told Caleb. You kill the ones that cannot take it, and you leave the ones that can. Do that long enough, and you are not killing weeds anymore. You are breeding the weeds that beat you. Caleb asked what beat resistance. Pause. That does. The cultivator was not smarter than the chemical. It was simpler than the chemical. A sweep did not care what mutation a weed carried. It did not care whether that weed's grandparents had survived 1,000 sprays. It did not ask the plant to absorb anything, metabolize anything, or fail at anything. It cut the root. Breath. That was Harlan's whole theory. Biology could adapt to chemistry. It could not adapt to being severed 2 inches under the surface by steel moving 4 miles an hour. Caleb believed him just enough to keep cultivating. Then he believed him for 10 years, then 15, then 20. And for most of that time, believing him looked exactly like being wrong. By the early 2000s, Roundup Ready farming was at its peak in the Delta. The fields were clean, the sprayers were fast, the seed reps were confident. The old cultivators were parked in fence rows, sold at auctions, or cut for scrap. Caleb still cultivated. Every June, while other farmers sprayed and left, Caleb sat on the 1066, leaning forward, watching the rows, making small corrections with his hands and smaller ones with his feet. He watched soil color, soil moisture, crop height, row spacing, and the way the sweeps threw dirt. He knew when clay was too wet and when a crust would break right. He knew the sound the cultivator made when it was riding too deep. The county did not see skill. Pause. It saw stubbornness. Then, in 2006, the joke started dying. That was the year resistant Palmer Amaranth became impossible to pretend away in parts of the Delta. Farmers sprayed glyphosate at normal rates and saw pigweed live. They sprayed again. Some fields looked injured for a week. Then the plants straightened back up and kept growing. The problem moved like a rumor. Except rumors do not make 500,000 seeds per plant. A resistant pigweed in one field became a resistant patch. A patch became a seed source. Seeds moved in water, on tires, in harvest equipment, and in the dirt stuck to everything that crossed a turn row. Within a few seasons, the county had fields where glyphosate no longer acted like weed control. It acted like a filter. It killed the weak plants. It left the expensive ones, and those were the only ones that mattered. The cost curve turned ugly fast. The farms that had been controlling weeds for $15 to $20 an acre were suddenly stacking herbicides, adding residuals, making multiple passes, and still sending crews into rows to pull the pigweed that lived. Some programs crossed $100 an acre. Some crossed $150 when labor was added. The cheap system had not stayed cheap. It had delayed the bill. Caleb's number barely moved. His cultivator still cost him diesel, sweeps, time, and repairs. His weed control was still somewhere around $50 an acre in real cost. It had looked foolish when his neighbors were spending under $20. Now some of them were spending triple what he spent, and still watching pigweed stand up after the sprayer left. His fields were not magic. Palmer amaranth seed blew in. It washed in. Birds moved it. Equipment dragged it. Caleb had pigweed like everyone else. The difference was that his pigweed did not get to finish the season. The seedlings came up. The cultivator passed. The roots were cut. The survivors were pulled before they set seed. The population never got the year chance to build itself into an army. There was no chemical bottleneck selecting for one rare survivor. There was just steel, soil, and timing. FFX, Cultivator, metal scraping lightly through dry soil. In July of 2009, a weed scientist from Mississippi State named Dr. Elaine Porter drove to Caleb's farm after hearing about him from an extension agent. She had spent years telling growers that herbicide resistance was not a mystery. It was selection pressure. It was repetition. It was the same tool used in the same way until nature found the crack. But when she recommended mechanical control, farmers stared back at her like she was recommending mule teams. Most of them did not own cultivators anymore. Many had never set one. The parts were hard to find. The skill was harder. The extension agent told her, "There is one man still doing it like his father did." Dr. Porter arrived on a hot afternoon when the air above the soybean rows was shimmering. Caleb was halfway through a field. The old 1066 rolling steady. Cultivator sweeps slicing through the middle. Behind him, the rows looked coned. Ahead of him, pigweed seedlings stood in the heat. The line between problem and solution was exactly as wide as the toolbar. She walked the rows after he shut down. The crop stand was better than she expected. The soil was loose, not scalped. Weeds lay upside down with their roots drying white in the sun. Caleb climbed down slowly. "You Mercer." "I am. I'm Elaine Porter, Mississippi State Extension." "I've heard you on the radio," Caleb said. "You're telling folks to cultivate." "I'm trying." "They listening?" "They're starting to." Caleb looked across the field. "That means the weeds got tall enough?" she asked, if she could bring farmers to see the place. Caleb did not like the idea. He had spent years being treated like a man who did not understand the future. He had no interest in becoming a prop now that the future had stopped working. But he also knew what 8-foot pigweed did to a cotton field. He knew what it did to a combine. He knew the look on a farmer's face when the math turned against him and there was no easy tool left. So he said yes. The first field day drew 39 farmers, 2 extension trucks, one local reporter, and several men who had laughed at Caleb's cultivator for years without ever standing close enough to watch it work. They stood at the edge of a soybean field while Caleb made a pass. It was not dramatic in the way a sprayer was dramatic. There was no mist hanging over the field, no massive boom, unfolding like a bridge, no computer screen showing application maps. There was only a tractor, a bar of steel, and 6 rows of weeds disappearing. The visual proof was immediate. In front of the cultivator, pigweed. Behind it, dying roots. No argument, no brochure, no promise of next year's formulation. One of the farmers asked the question everyone was thinking. Where do we buy one? Caleb wiped dust from his face. You probably already owned one. Pause, nobody laughed, he said. Most of you sold it when the chemical worked. Some of you cut it up when scrap got high. Some of you left it behind a shed until the shanks rusted through. That is the trouble with getting rid of a tool. You usually do it while you are sure you will never need it again. That line spread faster than the extension bulletin. By winter, used cultivators that had been worth scrap money were bringing real bids at farm auctions. Dealers started looking for old toolbars and shanks. Men who had spent years selling sprayers were suddenly asking retired farmers how to set sweeps, and that brought Ray Dobbins back to Caleb's place. SFX, gravel crunching under truck tires. Ray pulled into the driveway one March morning and sat in his truck longer than a man sits when he is bringing good news. Caleb was in the shed replacing worn sweeps. Sparks jumped from the grinder in bright orange bursts. Ray waited until Caleb shut it off. Morning, Caleb. Ray, I need to ask you something. Caleb set the grinder down. I need to learn cultivators. Caleb looked at him. Ray did not smile. Farmers are asking. I can find used rigs, rebuild some, maybe put together parts. But I don't know what good looks like anymore. I know sprayers. I know chemical programs. I don't know how close a sweep should run to cotton. I don't know what worn out means on a shank. I don't know what I told people to quit using. Caleb let the sentence sit there. Ray swallowed. You were right, Caleb said. I was patient. That is different. No, you were right about resistance. My father was right about resistance. I just believed him longer than everybody else believed the salesman. Ray looked at the cultivator frame. Can you show me? Caleb could have made him pay for every joke. He could have repeated the calculator numbers from the dealership counter. He could have asked how much money the county lost while Ray sold a system that removed the backup plan. Instead, he picked up a sweep and handed it to him. Pause, start here. For the next several weeks, Ray came back again and again. Caleb showed him how to read wear on a sweep, how a bent shank leaves a strip of weeds, how gauge wheels decide whether the tool cuts roots or just polishes dirt. He showed him why speed matters. Too slow and the soil does not roll. Too fast, and the cultivator throws dirt into young cotton. He showed him why wet clay lies to a beginner, and why dry crust can make a field look clean while roots stay alive underneath. Ray took notes like a man trying to learn a language he had once mocked. He later sold refurbished cultivators out of the same dealership that had spent years treating them like relics. Some buyers learned fast. Some cut crop roots and blamed the tool. Some gave up. Some kept calling Caleb until their hands learned what the manual could not teach. Caleb never charged them. He would climb onto a neighbor's tractor, make one pass, adjust the tool, make another, then step down and say, Feel what changed, because the hardest thing to replace was not the cultivator. Pause, it was the knowledge. The Delta had not merely adopted a chemical, it had outsourced a skill. When the chemical worked, that seemed efficient. When the chemical failed, the missing skill became part of the crisis. By 2015, the numbers no longer needed defending. Caleb's weed control still sat around $50 an acre when fuel, parts, and labor were counted. The county average had climbed far beyond the old Roundup years. Many farms were layering chemical programs, paying for multiple trips, and still losing yield where resistant Palmer Amaranth escaped. Caleb's cotton yields were not record-breaking, but they were steady. In some years, they beat the county average because his fields stayed cleaner late in the season. His neighbors had technology that could map a field from the cab, unfold a boom with a switch, and apply chemistry to the ounce. Caleb had a 30-year-old tractor, pulling a principle older than the tractor. Pause, cut the root before the weed makes seed. That was the mechanism. Not nostalgia, not romance, not a war against modern farming. Caleb used modern seed where it made sense. He read markets. He watched weather models. He was not allergic to technology. He was allergic to one-tool thinking, because one-tool thinking is how a farm loses control without noticing it. First, the tool saves time. Then the farm reorganizes, or then the old skill disappears. Then the new tool stops working, and suddenly the farmer discovers that the cheapest system was cheap because it was burning through tomorrow. Years later, Ray Dobbins sold his dealership. Margins had thinned. Equipment buyers were cautious. Chemical programs were more complicated than ever. He kept a small acreage near town and planted soybeans on it, not because he needed the money, but because he wanted to see whether he could do correctly what he had once dismissed. He bought one of the refurbished cultivators from his own inventory, set the sweeps at 2 inches, ran 4 miles an hour, called Caleb twice the first week. At the co-op, somebody asked Ray if he still believed the old way was wasteful. Ray said, "The old way wasn't cheap, it was honest. The new way was cheap until the weeds sent the invoice." Caleb heard about the line and gave no public response. Public response was not his style. He farmed, he fixed. He taught his son, Daniel, the things Harlan had taught him. How soil should roll, how crop roots sit in the row, how a toolbar should feel through the steering wheel, how not to confuse speed with progress. By then, Caleb was in his 70s. The 1066 had been rebuilt once. The cultivator had new sweeps, new bolts, and a patched toolbar. The metal wore down every year. The principle did not. The weed could adapt to a molecule. Pause, it could not negotiate with a blade. That is why Caleb's fields became a quiet lesson in the Delta. Not because the old farmer beat science. Science had been saying the same thing in different words. Selection pressure creates resistance. Diversity slows it. Mechanical control removes the genetic advantage. Caleb's father simply said it plainer. Pause. Don't train what you're trying to kill. The county trained pigweed for 20 years. Caleb cut its roots. And when the sprayers stopped solving the problem they were built to solve, the thing everyone called backward was still moving forward. 6 rows at a time.